What gives a piece of paper the power to shape nations, topple empires, and dominate global trade? The answer lies in the story of the US dollar, a currency that began as a desperate experiment during America's Revolution and went on to become the backbone of the world economy. At its birth in 1775, the fledgling United States had no treasury, no central bank, and no credibility on the global stage. Its early continental dollars were scorned as worthless. And yet, less than 2 centuries later, the greenback would eclipse the British pound to become the world's reserve currency, trusted from Wall Street to war zones, from oil markets to international diplomacy. The rise of the dollar is not just about money. It is a story of innovation, war, politics, and trust. A saga that connects the founding of a nation to the functioning of the global system today. From fragile paper to unrivaled power, this is the journey of the world's most influential currency. Long before the United States emerged, the world had already wrestled with the question of what makes money valuable. Civilizations from Mesopotamia to Rome had experimented with coins, precious metals, and early forms of credit. Gold and silver held appeal because they were scarce, durable, and widely recognized. By the 18th century, European empires had established vast monetary networks rooted in these metals, with the Spanish silver dollar, the pieces of 8, circulating widely across the Americas and even parts of Asia. This was the financial world inherited by the American colonies. Day-to-day trade was conducted in a patchwork of currencies: British pounds, Dutch guilders, Spanish reals, and even Native American wampum. There was no unified system, and the colonies often faced chronic shortages of hard currency. To fill the gap, some resorted to issuing paper notes backed by future tax revenues, an innovation viewed with suspicion in London, but vital for colonial survival. When revolution broke out in 1775, the Continental Congress faced an existential dilemma. It had no treasury and no authority to levy taxes across the colonies. Financing the war against the British Empire required a leap of faith, creating paper money not backed by gold or silver, but by the promise of future independence. These continental dollars were printed in massive quantities to pay soldiers and suppliers. The idea was revolutionary, but the execution proved disastrous. Lacking strong backing and plagued by rampant counterfeiting, often deliberately encouraged by the British, the continental dollar quickly lost value. By 1781, the phrase "not worth a continental" had entered common usage, a bitter reminder of the young nation's financial fragility. Yet even in failure, seeds were planted. The experience underscored 2 crucial lessons: the need for a stable, trusted currency and the importance of public confidence in its backing. Leaders like Alexander Hamilton absorbed these lessons deeply. In the 1790s, Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, pushed for a centralized financial system anchored by the new US dollar, modeled in part on the Spanish silver coin familiar to global trade. Thus, the dollar was born not simply as paper or metal, but as an idea, a unifying symbol of sovereignty, a tool for economic coordination, and a weapon of legitimacy in a skeptical world. Its earliest years were turbulent, marked by bank wars, competing state currencies, and fierce political debate over the role of government in money. But over time, these struggles forged a currency that would outlast its critics and lay the groundwork for global dominance. In its genesis, the US dollar was both fragile and bold, a reminder that money's power comes not from material alone, but from the collective trust of those who use it. The fragile experiment of the continental dollar had ended in near collapse, but it left behind a crucial insight. The United States needed a stable, unified currency that could command both domestic trust and international respect. The spark that transformed this vision into reality came in the early decades of the Republic, when leaders wrestled with how to turn paper promises into lasting power. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton presented his Report on Public Credit, a document that would become the financial foundation of the young nation. Hamilton argued that the federal government should assume state debts from the Revolutionary War and fund them at full value, thereby establishing creditworthiness. To anchor this, he called for a uniform currency, the US dollar, that would circulate across all states, supported by a central institution capable of managing debt and issuing notes. This vision materialized in 1791 with the creation of the First Bank of the United States. Modeled in part after the Bank of England, it issued notes denominated in dollars, redeemable in gold and silver. For the first time, the dollar became more than a theory. It was a functioning instrument of trade, backed by federal authority and precious metals. Trust, however, was not automatic. Many Americans, scarred by the continental collapse, distrusted paper money. Farmers and frontier communities often preferred barter or hard coin, seeing banknotes as tools of urban elites. Political opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, condemned Hamilton's system as dangerously centralized, even unconstitutional, but Hamilton's gamble paid off. The federal government's assumption of debt reassured creditors at home and abroad. International merchants, especially in Europe, began accepting the US dollar in trade. Gradually, banknotes issued under the new system gained credibility, serving as the prototypes for what would become the greenback. A crucial breakthrough came with the Coinage Act of 1792, which formally established the dollar as the nation's standard unit of money. Drawing inspiration from the Spanish silver dollar, widely trusted and used in Atlantic trade, Congress created a decimal system of coinage unique among world currencies. This decision simplified calculations and trade, marking a subtle but revolutionary leap in monetary design. The act authorized both gold and silver coins, setting the stage for the bimetallic standard that would define U.S. currency for decades. By legally grounding the dollar in tangible metal, the government reinforced confidence and distinguished the American system from its earlier unstable experiments with unbacked paper. The early decades were not without setbacks. The first bank faced fierce political resistance and was not rechartered in 1811, plunging the financial system into chaos. During the War of 1812, the government again resorted to paper issuance, leading to inflation and instability. It took the creation of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816 to restore order and re-establish the dollar's credibility. Through these cycles of crisis and recovery, one lesson became increasingly clear: the dollar was only as strong as the institutions that backed it. Each failure forced reforms, and each reform pushed the dollar closer to the durable, standardized system it would become. By the mid-19th century, the dollar was no longer a fragile experiment, but a defining symbol of the nation's identity. The introduction of the first standardized paper greenbacks during the Civil War marked a turning point. Unlike earlier notes, these were legal tender by law, not just by custom. Despite fierce opposition and early inflation, the greenback endured, proving that paper money, when anchored by strong government authority, could work. This was the true breakthrough. The United States had developed not just a working currency, but a financial system capable of evolving under strain. From Hamilton's prototypes to wartime greenbacks, the dollar had survived battles, panics, and politics. By the late 19th century, it was positioned not just as national currency, but as a potential contender on the global stage. The spark had been lit. The dollar was no longer merely a medium of exchange. It was becoming a weapon of stability, a vessel of trust, and in time, the foundation of a global economic order. The US dollar's rise from an experimental paper promise to a force that would one day dominate global finance was anything but linear. Its story is marked by cycles of crisis and recovery, innovation and regulation, expansion and contraction. Each milestone brought the dollar closer to becoming not only America's national currency, but also an international standard. The collapse of the first Bank of the United States in 1811 left the young republic without a central stabilizing force. The War of 1812 quickly exposed the dangers of this vacuum. The government struggled to finance military operations, private banks issued their own notes, and inflation surged. In response, Congress created the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, granting it a 20-year charter. This institution reintroduced federal oversight into the monetary system, regulating the flood of banknotes issued by state-chartered banks. While effective in stabilizing currency, it became a lightning rod of controversy. President Andrew Jackson, a fierce opponent of centralized banking, vetoed its recharter in 1832, calling it a tool of elites. By 1836, the Second Bank was dead, and the U.S. entered a period of what historians call the free banking era. Without a central bank, thousands of state banks issued their own paper notes, many backed by little or no reserves. Some notes circulated only locally. Others became worthless when banks failed. Known as wildcat banks, a term suggesting banks so remote that only wildcats roamed nearby. These institutions created a patchwork of unreliable money. Economic instability peaked in the Panic of 1837, when widespread bank failures triggered a deep depression. For ordinary Americans, trust in paper currency hit rock bottom. The era reinforced an enduring lesson. A currency's strength depended not just on its metal backing, but on the credibility of the institutions behind it. The Civil War forced another monetary revolution. To finance the Union's massive war effort, the Lincoln administration authorized the issuance of greenbacks, standardized paper notes not backed by gold or silver, but declared legal tender by law. This was a radical break from tradition. Critics warned of runaway inflation and instability, while supporters argued it was the only way to mobilize resources quickly. In practice, the greenback became both a lifeline and a symbol. Soldiers, farmers, and merchants alike used the notes, binding the economy together under a single paper standard. Although greenbacks did depreciate during the war, they survived. More importantly, their endurance legitimized the idea that paper currency could function as real money, provided it had the backing of government authority. To bring order to the fractured banking landscape, Congress passed the National Banking Acts, which established a system of nationally chartered banks. These banks could issue notes backed by federal government bonds, ensuring uniformity across the nation. This reform effectively ended the chaotic free banking era and introduced the national banknote, a precursor to the modern dollar bill. Though still not centrally managed by a single institution, the system provided stability and allowed the government to exert far more control over the money supply. By the 1870s, the U.S. fully embraced the gold standard, committing to redeeming dollars in gold at a fixed rate. This anchored the dollar in the global monetary system and facilitated international trade. Confidence soared, but the system came at a cost. During economic downturns, the rigid tie to gold limited the government's ability to expand the money supply. The Panic of 1893 and subsequent depressions revealed the weakness of this arrangement. As banks failed and credit dried up, Americans demanded reforms. One figure in particular, financier J.P. Morgan, personally organized bailouts to stabilize markets, a private solution to a public problem. The turning point came in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve System, designed as a compromise between centralized control and regional independence. The Fed became the nation's official central bank. It could issue a new form of currency, the Federal Reserve Note, and manage monetary policy to prevent crises. The Federal Reserve gave the dollar something it had never had before, a permanent institutional guardian. While not perfect, the Fed's existence fundamentally transformed the dollar from a fragile experiment into a managed, resilient system capable of meeting the challenges of the modern economy. The outbreak of World War I disrupted traditional financial powers. European nations suspended the gold standard to finance war spending, weakening their currencies. The US, however, entered the war later and emerged relatively strong, with gold reserves intact. By 1919, the US dollar had taken its first steps as a global reserve currency. International borrowers began issuing bonds in dollars, and the currency gained new prestige in global trade. Still, the British pound remained dominant, a supremacy the dollar would only later challenge. The interwar years brought both triumph and collapse. During the 1920s, the dollar strengthened, supported by booming industries and Wall Street's rise as a financial hub. But the Great Depression of 1929 shattered confidence. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took a dramatic step, suspending the gold standard domestically and ordering citizens to exchange gold for paper dollars. While controversial, this move freed the government to expand the money supply and stimulate recovery. The dollar was no longer a promise of gold. It was a promise of national authority. The decisive turning point came during World War II. In 1944, Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global financial order. The result, the US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, while all other major currencies would peg to the dollar. This arrangement made the dollar the central pillar of global finance. Its supremacy was built not just on gold, but on America's unmatched economic and military power at the end of the war. By the late 1940s, the dollar had decisively displaced the British pound as the world's leading currency. For decades, Bretton Woods anchored stability, but by the late 1960s, the system strained under pressure. The US was spending heavily on the Vietnam War and domestic programs, creating inflation and weakening trust in the dollar's gold backing. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced the suspension of gold convertibility, a moment known as the Nixon shock. The dollar was no longer tied to gold. Instead, it floated freely against other currencies. Critics predicted collapse, but the opposite occurred. Freed from rigid gold constraints, the dollar adapted to the realities of modern finance. The next great milestone was the rise of the petrodollar system. In the 1970s, the US struck agreements with major oil producers, particularly Saudi Arabia, to price oil exclusively in dollars. This ensured constant global demand for the currency, securing its dominance even without gold. Meanwhile, Wall Street became the beating heart of global finance. From Eurodollar markets in the 1970s to the financial liberalization of the 1990s, the dollar became the currency of choice for trade, investment, and reserves. In the 21st century, the dollar evolved yet again. It became the backbone of digital finance, from global electronic transfers to the rise of the SWIFT system for international payments. Even as new competitors like the euro and China's yuan emerged, the dollar retained overwhelming supremacy. By 2023, it accounted for nearly 60% of global reserves and the majority of international trade settlements. The dollar had become not just America's currency, but the world's. Its ascent was complete, from revolutionary paper notes to a global standard underpinning modern commerce. The dollar's rise was neither inevitable nor smooth. It endured collapses, wars, political battles, and radical reinventions. But with each challenge, it grew stronger. What began as a fragile experiment in the 18th century became, by the 21st, the indispensable pillar of global finance, from Hamilton's banknotes to Nixon's floating dollar, from Civil War greenbacks to Bretton Woods supremacy. The dollar's story is a chronicle of resilience and reinvention, and its evolution is still ongoing. The dollar's rise to supremacy was not simply a product of wars, politics, or chance. Beneath the sweeping historical milestones lay an intricate web of mechanisms, financial innovations, institutional designs, and geopolitical arrangements that allowed the dollar to evolve into more than just money. To understand why the greenback endures as the world's dominant currency, we must explore the hidden machinery that powers it. Every currency rests on trust, but the dollar's ascent required extraordinary confidence. Early continental dollars collapsed because faith evaporated. Later, greenbacks endured the Civil War because citizens trusted that victory would secure redemption. Over time, the U.S. built a reputation for honoring its debts. Unlike many nations, America never defaulted outright on its federal obligations. Even during crises like the Great Depression or the 2008 financial collapse, U.S. Treasury bonds were viewed as safe havens. This reliability transformed the dollar into a global trust network. In effect, when foreign governments, corporations, or individuals hold dollars, they are buying not just currency, but faith in U.S. stability. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 gave the dollar its institutional heart. The Fed's ability to issue elastic currency, expanding or contracting supply to meet demand, distinguished the dollar from rigid gold or silver systems. But the Fed's influence goes deeper. It manages monetary policy, setting interest rates that ripple across global markets. When the Fed raises or lowers rates, it doesn't just influence U.S. borrowing. It alters capital flows worldwide. Emerging markets rise or fall, depending on whether investors chase higher U.S. yields or flee to safer American assets. Thus, the Fed is not just America's central bank. It is effectively the world's central bank, shaping the rhythm of global finance through its decisions. A major pillar of the dollar's dominance is the U.S. Treasury bond. Issued by the government to finance debt, these bonds became the gold standard of safety in the modern economy. Why? Because treasuries are seen as virtually risk-free. They carry the full faith and credit of the United States, backed by the world's largest economy and its power to tax. They are highly liquid, easily bought and sold in vast quantities, and denominated in dollars, the world's primary reserve currency. Central banks worldwide stockpile treasuries as reserves. Global investors use them as collateral for trillions in transactions. In effect, U.S. debt has become the bedrock of global wealth storage. Ironically, the very thing once seen as America's weakness, its constant borrowing, became one of its greatest strengths. Perhaps the most ingenious hidden mechanism was the creation of the petrodollar system in the 1970s. After the U.S. abandoned the gold standard, it needed a new anchor to guarantee dollar demand. The solution came through diplomatic deals with Saudi Arabia and other major oil exporters. Oil would be priced exclusively in dollars. This meant that every nation needing energy, which is every nation, had to hold dollars to pay for it. This simple arrangement cemented perpetual demand for dollars. Whether in Asia, Africa, or Europe, industries needed oil, and oil required dollars. The petrodollar system effectively replaced gold as the foundation of the dollar's global supremacy. Less visible, but equally vital, is the infrastructure of payments. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT, launched in the 1970s, became the global messaging system for banks. While SWIFT is technically neutral, the vast majority of international transactions clear in dollars, funneled through U.S. banks. This gives Washington immense leverage. By controlling access to the dollar clearing system, the U.S. can impose sanctions with devastating effect, cutting adversaries off from global commerce. From Iran to Russia, nations have felt the weight of this financial weapon. Thus, the dollar is not only a medium of exchange, but also an instrument of geopolitical influence. Woven into the arteries of global finance, beyond U.S. borders, another hidden mechanism emerged: the euro-dollar market. Starting in the 1950s, foreign banks began holding dollar deposits outside the U.S., beyond Federal Reserve regulation. These offshore dollars multiplied rapidly, creating a parallel ecosystem of dollar liquidity. Today, euro dollars underpin global trade and finance. When a company in Brazil buys goods from Japan, The payment often flows through offshore dollar markets rather than directly through the US. This creates a feedback loop. The more the world uses dollars, the more demand for dollar-based instruments grows, reinforcing the cycle. The US benefits enormously, as global demand keeps interest rates lower at home and ensures that the dollar remains embedded in transactions far beyond its shores. The dollar's endurance also stems from financial creativity. Wall Street pioneered a dizzying array of innovations, derivatives, securitization, and structured finance that rely on dollar-denominated assets, for instance. The 2008 global financial crisis began with U.S. mortgage-backed securities, yet when panic struck, investors still fled into U.S. dollars and treasuries. The paradox illustrates a hidden truth. No matter the source of instability, the dollar remains the ultimate refuge. These innovations, while risky, expanded the ecosystem around the dollar, ensuring its central role in everything from commodity trading to global investment funds. Currencies thrive on network effects. The more they are used, the more valuable they become. Once the dollar became dominant in oil trade and finance, switching to another currency grew prohibitively costly. For example, even China, despite promoting the yuan, still conducts most international trade in dollars because global suppliers, insurers and shippers all default to the greenback. This entrenchment is not accidental. It is a product of decades of deep institutionalization. Finally, there is the intangible but powerful cultural dominance of the dollar. The greenback has become a global symbol of wealth, of stability, of American influence. Movies, music, and global media have reinforced its iconic status. A $100 bill in Lagos or Karachi carries trust in ways no other paper note can match. This psychological weight is as much a mechanism of power as the Federal Reserve or Treasury bonds. For billions around the world, the dollar is not just money. It is security itself. Behind every milestone in the dollar's ascent lies a deeper mechanism: the trust of markets, the oversight of the Fed, the liquidity of treasuries, the petrodollar system, the SWIFT network, the euro-dollar market, and the psychology of cultural dominance. Together, these innovations formed a self-reinforcing ecosystem. Each element, from oil pricing to global payments, tied the world more tightly to the dollar. Unlike currencies backed by a single commodity, the dollar is backed by an entire architecture of institutions, agreements, and expectations. The result is a currency that is not just a medium of exchange, but the operating system of global finance. History is never shaped by institutions alone. Behind every policy, every financial innovation, and every turning point in the story of the dollar are individuals, visionaries, pragmatists, opportunists, and critics, whose choices determined the fate of the currency that came to rule the world. To understand the rise of the dollar, we must listen to the voices and lives that animated its journey. In the late 18th century, the United States was fragile, fractured, and deeply in debt. Into this chaos stepped Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. Born out of wedlock in the Caribbean and rising through talent and ambition, Hamilton envisioned a financial system that would make the young republic credible in the eyes of the world. He insisted that the federal government assume state debts, that the U.S. honor its obligations in full, and that a national bank be created to stabilize credit. To critics like Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's plan seemed elitist, a betrayal of agrarian democracy. But Hamilton was thinking globally. Only by building a trustworthy credit system could the U.S. enter the world of great powers. His legacy endures in the greenback itself, which became a vessel of American creditworthiness. When the Civil War broke out, Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase faced an impossible dilemma: how to finance a war larger than anything the U.S. had ever fought. The answer was the creation of greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold or silver, but by the government's promise alone. Critics derided them as flimsy and unstable, Yet the greenbacks funded the Union war effort and created for the first time a truly national paper currency. Chase's gamble paid off, though inflation followed. Today his face is remembered less than Lincoln's. But without Chase, the American dollar might never have found its footing as a symbol of state-backed financial power. The panic of 1907 exposed the fragility of America's banking system. Banks collapsed, markets seized, and private financiers like J.P. Morgan had to step in to save the nation's economy. The lesson was clear. America needed a central bank. President Woodrow Wilson, guided by Congressman Carter Glass and Senator Robert Latham Owen, pushed through the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. Glass, a Virginia newspaperman turned politician, drafted the act that created the Fed's decentralized but coordinated structure. Their vision was not merely to stabilize banking, but to give the dollar an institutional backbone strong enough to support a global role. In the decades that followed, this vision proved prophetic. In 1933, amid the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt made a decision that shocked Americans. He took the country off the gold standard for domestic use and forbade the hoarding of gold coins. For centuries, gold had been seen as the ultimate guarantee of value. Roosevelt's move was seen by many as a betrayal, but for him, it was liberation. By delinking the dollar from gold, Roosevelt gave the government the flexibility to expand credit and combat the Depression. Critics saw recklessness. Supporters saw innovation. Roosevelt's boldness set the stage for the dollar's evolution into a fiat currency, one based on faith, not metal, and eventually its dominance in the post-war world. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial order. Two men dominated the stage: Britain's John Maynard Keynes and America's Harry Dexter White. Keynes, the famed economist, wanted a balanced system with a supranational currency called the Bancor. White, representing the United States, insisted that the dollar, backed by gold, should anchor the system. In the end, White's vision prevailed. The Bretton Woods system was born, with the dollar at its heart. The rivalry between these two men embodied the passing of the torch. From a Britain clinging to its waning power to a United States ready to shape the financial destiny of the world. In 1971, President Richard Nixon faced a crisis. Foreign governments, led by France, were demanding gold in exchange for their swelling dollar reserves. The U.S. gold supply was draining rapidly. In what became known as the Nixon shock, he suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. Critics predicted collapse. Instead, Nixon's gamble untethered the dollar completely, making it a fiat currency. Paradoxically, this move consolidated the dollar's global dominance as demand shifted from gold to dollar-denominated financial instruments and energy trade. Nixon, often remembered for scandal, reshaped the financial world with a stroke of policy. By the late 1970s, U.S. inflation was spiraling out of control. The dollar's credibility teetered. Enter Paul Volcker, the towering Federal Reserve chairman. Volcker raised interest rates to unprecedented levels, triggering a painful recession but ultimately crushing inflation. His resolve restored global confidence in the dollar. Central banks and investors, reassured by America's willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term stability, doubled down on the greenback. Volcker's era proved that credibility, once lost, could be restored only through ruthless discipline. Not all voices celebrated the dollar's dominance. French President Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s denounced what he called America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that the rest of the world had to use. Others, from European bankers to modern-day Chinese officials, echoed the complaint, the dollar system locks other nations into dependence on U.S. policy. These critics remind us that the dollar's story is not universally admired. It is a tale of power, sometimes resented, often envied and always watched closely. Beyond great names and grand policies, the dollar's story is also told through countless ordinary people. A shopkeeper in Cairo who insists on dollars, not local currency. A migrant worker in Mexico who sends remittances in greenbacks. A dissident in Eastern Europe who hides US bills under the floorboards as insurance against state collapse. These silent users, billions worldwide, are the true lifeblood of the dollar's supremacy. Their trust, born of lived experience, is what makes the greenback more than a national currency. The rise of the US dollar is not only a chronicle of institutions and policies, but a biography of human ambition, fear, and ingenuity. Hamilton's vision, Chase's gamble, Roosevelt's boldness, White's diplomacy, Nixon's shock, Volcker's discipline, all left fingerprints on the currency we hold today. And in the hands of ordinary people across the globe, the dollar continues to carry not just economic value, but stories of survival, opportunity, and trust. The greenback is, in the end, a profoundly human creation, fragile in theory, enduring in practice, because people have chosen time and again to believe in it. The US dollar is more than a unit of account, more than paper and ink. It is a weapon, a lifeline, a cultural icon, and a symbol of American influence stitched into the very fabric of the modern world. Its global impact is as much about politics and power as it is about economics. Since the end of World War II, the dollar has been inseparable from American foreign policy. At Bretton Woods, the dollar's tie to gold made it the anchor of the international system. After 1971, when gold was abandoned, the greenback remained central, not by force of law, but by trust, habit, and power. The US government learned to wield the dollar as an instrument of strategy. Economic sanctions, freezing assets, cutting off access to dollar-denominated trade, and restricting banks' access to the US financial system became a potent weapon. Nations from Iran to North Korea, Russia to Venezuela, have felt the sting of dollar dominance when Washington closes financial gates. This leverage is unique. No other currency has such reach. To be locked out of the dollar system is to be locked out of global commerce. In this way, the dollar is not just money, it is diplomacy, enforced through spreadsheets and settlement systems. Perhaps the most important geopolitical moment for the dollar after Nixon's 1971 shock came in the 1970s oil crisis. When oil prices surged and the US sought stability, Washington struck a deal with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members. Oil would be priced exclusively in dollars. This petrodollar arrangement ensured that every nation importing oil, from Japan to Germany, from Brazil to India, needed dollars to keep its economy running. In turn, surplus oil revenues were reinvested into US government securities and banks, creating a cycle that bound energy markets, finance, and geopolitics tightly together. The petrodollar entrenched the dollar's dominance at a moment when some feared it might falter. Energy, the lifeblood of modern economies, became inseparable from the US financial system. By the late 20th century, the dollar had become the universal language of trade. Even when Americans were not directly involved, businesses invoiced contracts in dollars. Commodities such as oil, wheat, copper, and gold were priced in dollars on global markets. This practice gave American banks and corporations a structural advantage. Dollar invoicing created natural demand for US financial services, from currency hedging to loans. It also made the Federal Reserve's policies ripple across the globe. When the Fed raises interest rates, capital often floods back into the US, leaving emerging markets vulnerable. For countries outside the US, the dollar is both a stabilizer and a trap, a safe haven in times of crisis, but also a reminder that financial sovereignty is often constrained by policies made in Washington. DC, beyond economics, the dollar carries enormous cultural weight. The greenback has become shorthand for wealth, aspiration, and power. In Hollywood films, stacks of $100 bills symbolize both ambition and corruption. In hip-hop lyrics, the dollar is both celebration and critique. Globally, the dollar is fetishized as an object of security. During the Cold War, US bills were smuggled behind the Iron Curtain, hidden in mattresses in Eastern Europe and traded in black markets. Even today, in unstable economies like Zimbabwe or Lebanon, the dollar circulates alongside or in place of local money. The physical design of the dollar adds to its aura. The portraits of presidents and founding fathers, the Great Seal with its all-seeing eye, and the simple green ink have made the currency instantly recognizable worldwide. Few symbols of America, the flag, the eagle, the Statue of Liberty, rival the global familiarity of the dollar bill. For developing countries, the dollar has been both blessing and burden. On one hand, dollar loans and reserves allow nations to stabilize their economies and finance growth. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions deeply tied to the US, often distribute aid and loans denominated in dollars. On the other hand, dollar-denominated debt can become a straitjacket. When local currencies fall, debts in dollars balloon. Latin America in the 1980s and Asia in the 1990s both experienced devastating crises tied to dollar liabilities. Critics argue this dependence creates a form of financial neo-colonialism, binding poorer nations to the decisions of the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. During the Cold War, the dollar was as much a weapon as the nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union championed the ruble within its bloc, but its reach never extended far. Meanwhile, the dollar symbolized not just capitalism, but freedom of exchange. When Berliners tore down the wall in 1989, dollars flowed into Eastern Europe, a sign of both material aid and ideological victory. In Russia, during the 1990s, many salaries were paid in dollars rather than rubles, a stark reminder of where people placed their trust. In this way, the Cold War was fought not only in space and arms, but in currency. The dollar, backed by American stability and global trade networks, outlasted its rival, cementing its role as the world standard. Beyond sanctions and oil, the dollar has played a subtler role as soft power. To use dollars is to engage with American institutions, its banks, its markets, its culture of consumption. As tourists spend greenbacks abroad, as multinationals settle accounts, and as migrants send remittances home, the dollar spreads not just value, but identity. The dominance of the dollar reflects America's military and political clout. But it also reflects the cultural magnetism of the US people want what the dollar represents: stability, reliability, and the dream of opportunity. Over the decades, rivals have tried to challenge the dollar's supremacy. The euro, launched in 1999, was hailed as a potential competitor, especially after the creation of the European Central Bank. China's yuan, backed by the world's second-largest economy, has gained ground in recent years, particularly in Asia and Africa, yet none has matched the dollar's liquidity, depth of financial markets, or global trust. Even during crises, from the 2008 financial crash to the COVID-19 pandemic, investors flocked to the dollar. Far from losing ground, the dollar often strengthens in turmoil. This paradox underscores its unique role. The dollar is not just one currency among many, but the foundation upon which others measure themselves. Perhaps the greatest testament to the dollar's global impact is its sheer reach. More than half of all international reserves held by central banks are in dollars. Roughly 90% of global forex trades involve the dollar. Entire economies, Ecuador, Panama, El Salvador, have adopted it outright. In practice, the dollar has transcended its national origins. It is an American currency, but also a global public good. Its stability underpins trade, finance, and even everyday survival in fragile economies. Few empires in history have projected such influence without boots on the ground. The dollar is more than money. It is a geopolitical lever, a cultural icon, a development tool, and a mirror of American power. Its impact has shaped wars, built economies, and defined aspirations. Unlike Rome's legions or Britain's navy, America's empire has no single map. Instead, it is inscribed in contracts, in reserves, in the notes tucked into wallets from Lagos to Lima. The dollar is America's silent ambassador. At once loved, resented, relied upon, and feared, its global reach reveals a simple truth. In the modern world, sovereignty is not only about land or armies, but about who controls the currency that others cannot live without. And for now, that power rests in the greenback. As the world moves deeper into the 21st century, the US dollar faces both unprecedented challenges and extraordinary opportunities. While it has long been unshakable, the landscape of technology, geopolitics, and finance is evolving, and the greenback's dominance is no longer guaranteed by habit alone. One of the most significant shifts on the horizon is the rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. The Federal Reserve is actively exploring a digital dollar, a secure, programmable version of the currency that could operate alongside physical bills. A digital dollar would allow instant settlements, lower transaction costs, and integrate more fully with global payment networks. Other countries, particularly China with its digital yuan, are moving faster. If digital currencies become the norm, the dollar's traditional infrastructure, banks, SWIFT, and Treasury bonds, will need to adapt. The question is whether the US can maintain its lead in a world where money is code as much as paper. The rise of China, the European Union, and regional economic blocs has sparked speculation about a multi-currency future. Could the yuan, euro, or even a basket of currencies reduce global reliance on the dollar? Analysts note that for now, alternatives lack the liquidity, trust, and depth of financial markets that the dollar enjoys. Yet, as nations diversify reserves and trade increasingly outside dollar channels, the greenback may lose some influence in certain regions. The challenge for the US is maintaining credibility and stability while adapting to a more multipolar financial system. Environmental, social, and governance (ESG) initiatives are reshaping investment flows. Green bonds, sustainable finance, and climate-linked derivatives are all denominated in dollars. This trend could strengthen the currency's centrality, positioning it as the standard for financing global sustainability efforts. Conversely, economic shocks from climate change, hurricanes, droughts, and supply chain disruptions could create volatility. How the US manages these risks will influence whether the dollar remains the world's safe haven. Cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies present another challenge. Bitcoin and other digital assets promise decentralized alternatives to traditional currencies. While they currently lack the stability and institutional backing to threaten the dollar directly, they signal a shift in perception. Trust in code rather than government is becoming viable. Financial institutions may integrate blockchain to make dollar-based transactions faster, safer, and more transparent. How well the US adapts to these innovations will shape the greenback's future relevance. The dollar's story is far from finished. Will it remain the global reserve currency for another century? Can a digital dollar coexist with emerging financial technologies? How will geopolitical realignments, climate crises, and technological disruption influence trust in the greenback? One certainty is that the greenback's strength rests not on the ink of its notes, but on collective belief by governments, institutions, and individuals worldwide. The next chapter of the dollar is being written in real time, and its course will depend on policy choices, innovation, and global perception. The US dollar has survived revolutions, wars, and economic crises. Its dominance is a product of institutions, trust, and networks. Yet as we look ahead, the greenback faces a world that is faster, more digital, and increasingly multipolar. Its future will depend on adaptability as much as legacy. A reminder that even the most powerful currency must evolve to remain relevant. The journey of the US dollar is a story of ambition, innovation, and influence. From Hamilton's visionary financial system to the greenback's global dominance today, the dollar has shaped economies, geopolitics, and everyday lives across continents. It has funded wars, stabilized markets, enabled trade, and even inspired culture, proving that money is never just money, but a reflection of power, trust, and human ingenuity. As we look to the future, the dollar faces new challenges: digital currencies, geopolitical shifts, and technological disruption. Yet its resilience over centuries reminds us that trust, institutions, and adaptability are the true pillars of lasting influence. The greenback story is far from over, and the decisions we make today will determine its role for generations to come. If you found this journey insightful, like the video, share it with others. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more. The story of the dollar is both history and living reality, and now you are part of it.